Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is novelist and editor Juliet Grames. Juliet, I'm so glad you are out here in Seattle and have time to talk to me today.
I'm so excited to be here. This is a highlight of my book tour. So,
You're too kind. So your first novel, called The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, came out last year, recently. And tell me about it. How did it come about?
well, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna is the story of two sisters who are born in southern Italy, in Calabria, which is the southernmost toe of the boot, around a little after World War I. And it covers 100 years of their lives over their best friendship and eventually the dissolution of their friendship in a blood feud whose origins are very obscure. And so it follows them through growing up in this impoverished Italian South between the wars, their emigration to the United States, where they land in an Italian-American community in Hartford, Connecticut, and all kinds of family dramas and vicissitudes to try to kind of pick apart where the feud came from. So that's the story. And the inspiration was my own Italian-American family, especially my grandmother, who had a very wacky life, including 8 near-death experiences. She lived to be almost 100 years old, and I was very inspired by both her toughness and her sense of humor and survivalism against the odds in these difficult circumstances. And I was very inspired by her immigration story, but also by the allegorical nature of these near-death experiences she'd had, which really spoke to me as kind of the difficult elements of life for a woman in the 20th century. And I really wanted to write about that, about the strength and bravery of women of our grandmothers' and mothers' generations.
You certainly created this wonderful, wonderful character. I mean, it's hard to read the book without just being enchanted with Stella.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
I can imagine that you as a child sat down and, you were at your grandmother's knee and, tell me all these stories.
I definitely loved hearing my grandmother's stories and her sister, my great aunt's stories, and I spent a lot of time with them. They actually took care of me while my parents were working, so I really got to imbibe a lot of Calabria's culture before I started school myself. And I'm very proud of the Italian-American heritage in my family and what we eat and how we cook, our songs and our stories, our proverbs. But the other thing that happened around that same time that I went to school was that my grandmother had a cerebral trauma and ended up having a life-saving lobotomy. And so although I got to really enjoy her and her storytelling for my early years, none of my younger cousins did. I'm the oldest in the family. And she survived this life-saving surgery that she had when I was 5, but she had been lobotomized. So her personality was drastically changed, and she didn't have that same access to our reality or to the stories that she had been telling. And I think that really calcified my intense sense of Italian pride and my desire to understand her experience, because it was suddenly lost to me even though she was right in front of me. So I started formally collecting her oral histories from her, other women of her generation. Right around then, when I was 5 and 6 years old, I would go over to their houses and tape record them and take notes and try to write up stories. And it took about 30 years for all of that to kind of coalesce into a novel. But yes, that was definitely the source of my inspiration.
It must be so lovely for your cousins then to have this book.
I hope so. They have been so kind and supportive about it, and it is a novel. It's
Right.
fictionalized, and Stella Fortuna, the eponymous character, she's not my grandmother. So a lot of other Italian-American experiences have been knitted in here.
Right.
So I was a little worried when it came out that they would read it and they'd say, "Oh, this isn't our grandma's story," but I think that they have seen it as I intended it, an homage to her and other women of her generation and what they went through, and I'm really grateful to them for their support.
Yeah, I think that that's so interesting, because so often readers think that a character who bears some resemblance to someone real is that person.
Yeah, this is something I've also encountered as an editor. So many authors, perhaps especially female authors, they're assumed to be the character that they're writing about. And I know you must have also struggled with this when you were writing your novel.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
No, it is always, and of course I did lean very heavily on received oral histories to create this, because I'm writing about a world here where in the 1920s and 30s in Calabria, most of the population was still illiterate. There's not a lot of text to describe this period. There's not book access to this history, and I had to find other solutions to recreating what life would have been like then. So there were a lot of oral histories, a lot of, I mined things like recipes, which can really reveal family traditions, but also, you know, the resources that would have been available at certain times of years, folk songs, especially proverbs.
Yeah, talk about, like, I remember hearing you say what a proverb.
Yeah.
Were you, like, is there a proverb that you remember that you?
There were so many, yeah. So I when I arrived in Calabria to do this 4-week research trip I did when I was in the early phases of this book, I ended up living with a retired postman and his wife. And they quickly figured out that I didn't know how famous Calabria was for proverbs. And so when we were going around collecting oral histories, he would always first sit down with our hosts and be like, tell us your favorite proverbs. She loves proverbs. So I think because Calabria's history has been very difficult, and it's thought of as kind of the backwater of Italy, this impoverished south, a colonial outpost that was basically a feudal holding of Spain for the last 600 years, and just generally looked down upon. So the Calabrese have a reputation for hard-headedness and kind of a roughshod demeanor, and which
sort of straightforwardness,
yes.
telling it like it is.
Oh, sure. I mean, they call themselves gabadost, which is a Calabrese for stubborn, hard-headed, but they have this amazing sense of humor that I think has gotten them through the darker patches of that history. And it really does manifest in these proverbs, which are sometimes both dark and funny. So I did get to incorporate, I think, 12 or 13 of them in the book, but I collected more, like 100 over time. And some of them are just, I couldn't work into the text. I hope I can use them somewhere. But for example, one of the ones I didn't get to use in the text was La gallina fa l'uovo, ma o gallo subruge o colo, which means the hen is the one who lays the egg, but the rooster's the one complaining about a sore butt, which I think is kind of a distillation of this, life is hard, but also the patriarchy is a little bit funny and we're going to make fun of it. So while enduring these hardships. So yeah, they were a really important source for me as well.
You should do a book of Calabrian proverbs.
I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about it.
Just as a little gift,
yeah.
A gift thing.
It's definitely on that project list of things I want to do.
Right. So you mentioned also that in the introduction, said that you were an editor. You're an editor at Soho Books, which does one of my favorite publishers because of all the crime novels. And many of my favorite writers are Soho.
Mine too, what a coincidence.
What a coincidence. We have so much in common. So how did that come about, your being, and where did that fit into your when I grow up I want to be scenario?
My when I grow up I want to be scenario was always I wanted to be a writer. And really from the time I was so little and collecting my grandmother's story, I wanted to write about her. And so when I was graduating from college, I had this very misguided idea that if I worked in publishing, it would help me come closer to being a writer, and especially a published writer, which at the time was a goal I thought was worthy of pursuit. And I look back on this time with chagrin at my naivety, both about the difference between craft and publication, and also about the idea that I would ever be able to write if I was going to be editing other people's books. And so for about 15 years, I focused on being an editor and learning that craft. And I tried writing for intervals during that period, but I found it was very hard to carve out brain space while I was doing justice to editing other people's work,
right.
Really separating my voice from theirs. It was hard. And so obviously it was a failure becoming an editor when I wanted to be a writer. Would have been the story I told you exactly 5 years ago. And then somehow now it ended up becoming a good plan after all, because after 15 years of writing in those intervals, I did manage to finish a book. And I think that because I had learned to edit other people, it helped me self-edit, which is probably the hardest thing for debut authors. I've now worked with many debut authors, so I know that. And so in the end, it turned out to be the best career choice I possibly could have made. I think I'm not really considered a spring chicken among debut novelists,
right.
But I hate that debuts have to come out when you're young. I don't think that's fair in terms of lived experience.
Like look at me, right?
Exactly.
Definitely not a spring chicken. But
I do also think that the book that I was able to write was much better than it would have been if I hadn't had 15 years of editorial experience behind me.
So, what I've heard from lots of authors, and certainly I think it was the case for me when I was writing George and Lizzie, is that I had a lot of trouble. I didn't want to read a lot of fiction because of what you said, because I was a little bit afraid, although in my case, the voice of the narrator in George and Lizzie is so strong that nothing could leak into that, I don't think. But what I've heard from many other authors is that they don't like to read fiction because they're afraid that the voice from those other books will kind of bleed into their novels.
I think for me, reading is not a problem. Editing is, because if you're a caretaking editor, you really try to get into the brain of the writer and to live in their voice as you're suggesting any changes to their text. Right. You're not superimposing your own voice. So especially when you're developmental or line editing another writer's work, I personally wouldn't be able to write during those periods. That's I mean, both for me, it wouldn't work out ethically because I would feel that there would be a bleed. It wouldn't be right for the writer. I would hate to deprive them of my best editorial work possible. So I really did have to leave space there. I would work, if I'm on an edit, then I don't write during that period. I spend my working hours when I'm supposed to be working on my book doing things like reading and research. And then I set out other blocks of time when I'm not editing, because as an editor, there are many work days that don't involve editing.
Right. Right.
So then I would write during those periods and cram in weekends and early mornings and things like that.
Soho specializes in crime fiction.
I am the crime fiction editor at Soho, so that was my mandate. I was brought on for a decade ago, and I really love it. I came in not knowing a lot about crime fiction, and my boss was very generous and hired me for this position because she knew that I had had experience working at other independent publishers, and she thought that would translate. And I promised her that I was designing this curriculum to learn crime fiction. And a lot of the writers who have been publishing with Soho for many years were very generous and helped me walk in those in my predecessor's very large shoes for the first couple years, and now I'm an evangelist for crime fiction. So although I haven't written it yet, I would happily get on my soapbox and tell you why it's really cool and important literature.
Do you think you will write crime fiction? Is what you're working on now?
It's funny you mentioned that. Yes, I really want to write crime fiction. I'm working on a mystery novel, and as I'm sure you know, you can't really tell until you finish the draft if you're ever going to get there with it. Right. So, but I'm pretty deep in. It was an outgrowth of research I did about Calabria, which is just a fascinating place. But the village that I wrote about Jevoli in Stella Fortuna, like every village in Calabria, is so remote. And I mean, they were all built defensively up in the mountains to protect against raiders. So what happens is these villages are so inaccessible, they really develop an independent culture. And Jevoli was different than any other village I was researching. So I did tons of research on these interesting places that I couldn't use at all. So I'm writing a crime novel set deep in the south of Calabria in a mountain range called the Aspromonte, where there are still villages that are so secluded that they speak ancient Greek.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so...
And that's true?
That is true.
Wow.
That is true to this day.
Wow.
So it's going to be set in 1960. It's about an idealistic young woman who goes to one of these remote villages with a charity group to build a nursery school and doesn't realize that she is going to end up kind of acting as an amateur sleuth to help solve a local problem. And I'm just having so much fun reading it and writing it.
Wow. But the difference between, in some ways, the difference between literary, what we call literary or non-genre fiction, and crime fiction is that crime fiction or science fiction or any of those genres really emphasizes plot. Not that it doesn't have good characters, but the characters, it has always seemed to me, are in the service of the plot.
That's interesting.
But in Stella Fortuna, the plot is in service to the character.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a fair distinction?
I do.
Or a reasonable distinction?
I do. I think that one of the conversations I have most often with authors I work with, when they're struggling with the path of their how the book is going to play out, is to follow the character. And of course, that's advice you hear for writers of any genre. Right. Writing Stella Fortuna was really difficult from that perspective because Stella was my central character. She was what the book grew out of, but she was inspired by my grandmother who had been lobotomized. So when I was trying to create a character who walked in my grandmother's footsteps during her youth, I found I just didn't know my own grandmother. I couldn't get to her. The questions I asked her were not fruitful. Right. She was a cipher. So I knew what had happened to her, and I ended up having this plot, these beats of this life that I wanted to hit, but I had to really invent a character inside of them. Yes. So even this book I had to do kind of backwards from that perspective, despite wishing I could have followed a character-driven book, as I've advised so many other people to do when they're writing.
Yeah. Do you outline? Did you outline for this?
I'm an outliner. I am. I outline everything. I outline text messages before I send them. So yeah. Yes.
Well, so it was very detailed. So
yes.
you knew.
I knew everything that was going to happen, and the challenge was to try to breathe life into it, to make a real girl do these things, and it was hard. It was hard. It was a really different time and place. Stella and her family have very different values than I have. Right. It's part of the reason that I had to have a modern narrator helping to move this story along, because although I hold real historical fiction writers in the very highest esteem for what they do, I'm not able to do that. I'm not able to step back and let the period mores take over and only exist within that time frame. I had too many axes to grind with the world around Stella and the things she had to go through. So I had to have some modern interpolation.
I had an interesting conversation with Madeline Miller, who wrote Circe, and about her feelings about John Updike's The Witches of Eastwick and King Lear, in both of which the men have this sort of horror of the kind of the way women's bodies are viewed. And she made the really interesting comparison that for John Updike in The Witches of Eastwick, it's the narrator. It's the narrator who is making these comments on women's bodies. Yeah. But in Lear, it's Lear's change of personality and his, that she could forgive Lear for all that because it's an aspect of his character. But she could not forgive the narrator.
That is interesting.
Isn't that interesting? And I think that says something about what you were saying about the way the best historical novelists, Dorothy Dunnett, I think of as a great historical novelist, can get into those?
Well, the thing, my core tenet that I came out of this book thinking was that women of that generation, so my grandmother was born in 1920, but despite the difficult things they did to keep their families together, would be appraised by their modern children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, on these very harsh set of parameters about femininity and grace and what women are supposed to be. And I think especially for women who came from such impoverished, destitute backgrounds, which was, to be honest, many of our ancestors were refugees and immigrants, and they did things that were not attractive, not feminine to survive, to keep their families together. And it is this, I'm just going to say it, it's the patriarchy that has always told us to preserve the heroism of the men in these stories, that we can't speak ill of our great-grandfathers because of the difficult things they did for us. But what ends up happening is the cost to our great-grandmothers' reputations. And that was what my modern narrator wanted to say. Stella Fortuna suffers, and she is a difficult woman, and there's a reason that she's difficult, and she deserves respect and a restored legacy. And those were things I found I couldn't say in contemporaneous voices. I needed a modern narrator to remind us to revisit the legacies of our grandmothers.
And also, for many of those women, I mean, partly it's just rescuing them from the graveyard of history.
Telling their stories.
Telling
That's
their
it.
stories.
Yes.
At all
Yes.
is such a valuable thing. And the stuff that, I mean, even though you're talking about a woman born, not you, the narrator is talking about a woman born in 1920, there's a lot in here about that kind of, I'm thinking about the Me Too movement and how hard it was at this time for women to stand up for themselves.
Yeah, especially if you don't have that lexicon.
Right.
I mean, they're coming from a very Catholic patriarchy that has lived under feudalism for many hundreds of years now. So there are many levels of constraint on the women here. They have no citizenship, they can't own land, they can't control money, they belong to their husbands who own nothing else. They own nothing but their women because they have also suffered under feudalism for so long. They go to work when they're 6 years old, so they can't go to school, and so there's no way to break the cycle except for them emigration, which is how they ended up coming to America. And there's a lot of tragedy in this story, but there's a lot of strength as well. And the thing is that a woman like Stella wouldn't have had the educational tools to understand that she had been wronged by history or by the men in her life. All she knows is her own stubbornness and her own will to live. And that was a story I wanted to give some space.
Yeah. When you're choosing books to publish, when you're acquiring books for Soho, what do you look for in a manuscript?
This is very trite, and every editor says it, but I look for voice. And you know that from the first sentence. You know if this is something you haven't read before. Because especially, every book has been written 100,000 times, not just in the crime fiction genre, in all genres. Books are written over and over again, and the only thing that makes them different is the voice that the author brings to it. So yeah, I'm looking for something I've never seen before, and people are all individuals, so it's there. We all have it.
What do you think the appeal is of series books?
I think that relates to our modern desire for more. I think it's the same reason we're moving away from, silver screen and more to kind of TV series. When we get to engage with the character for longer, I think we actually have a longer attention span for media than we give ourselves credit for, and a lot of us are looking for more engagement with the character than we get in just one volume. So my temptation, of course, in writing a single book that is not a series is for it to go on for 600,000 words, but that's not really tenable. So but I think one of the nice things about editing crime fiction series is being able to have a character arc develop over, 10 books, thousands of pages, instead of having to be limited to 300. So then you can have a supporting cast that's very strong. And in our real lives, we all have supporting casts that deeply affect us. So that's another thing that I think readers appreciate.
When you were working with your editor on this, what was the biggest problem?
So, I'm going to tell you a secret.
Okay, we won't tell anybody.
Okay, so it's not really a spoiler because it ended up getting cut from the final text, but there was a time when Cettina, Stella's little sister, had a fiance in Italy, and he was just taking up too much page space, and so he ended up getting cut out. And my editor was so smart about finding the area, the part of the book that needed a little bit of trimming and tightening without depriving any of the heart of the story. And it was something I had read and edited this book 800,000 times. That's a slight exaggeration, but not
maybe 700,000.
Yeah, maybe 700,000. And I had become blind to that, and she was able to spot it and help me make it much tighter. So I'm a good editor is just so valuable, and I don't, obviously I'm an evangelist for editors, but I think it's something I would hate to have to do it alone without an editor.
Right. Yeah. So can you recommend a couple of books to us that you've enjoyed recently? I know that's the hardest question, and because I can never remember, but is there some that you remember that you've really enjoyed recently?
You mean to read?
To read, or give us some, yes, to read.
Okay, to read. Well, I'm going to nepotistically have to lean a little bit on the Soho list.
Yes.
So I will not nepotistically start with a book I did not edit, which is a book by Gina Apostle called Insurrecto, which is set in the Philippines, and it's about a Philippine translator who partners up with an American filmmaker who's sort of a kind of Sofia Coppola character to uncover the secret about a rebellion that happened there. It's fantastic. It's so good.
One more.
Okay, well, on the crime list, was a book I edited that came out recently was Sujata Massey's The Widows of Malabar Hill, which is a mystery that I'm just so proud of. It's set in 1920 in Bombay, and it's about a female lawyer, the first female lawyer in India, who was inspired by a real historical figure and who becomes a sleuth for women who live in Purda. And it's really a fantastic, beautiful story set in...
Well, actually, it's funny that you say that because I interviewed Sujata for Book Lust a couple months ago. And so people can watch that episode and learn all about, and meet her, and she's a delight. But the book also is just great. Well, Juliet, the time has flown. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me, Nancy. This is a dream come true. Thank you.